Oh, I did not get that. And Allison. So at this point, we don't form.
Michael was in earlier today and got his packages, so I'm assuming he'll be here in the next.
Couple of minutes.
Yeah, we just need one more.
Yeah. Well, we got 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, forum.
I'll go on. I can't use it all.
Hey, it was a good piece in the undercurrent.
Hello, Mike.
Oh, did you like that? Yeah. I held on to that one for a while because it's one of these hot button issues and it's sort of sinking.
That's pretty tough to go out.
I lost another 2 chickens yesterday.
For what?
Otters.
So, do you remember, I don't know, you probably knew Richard Wood. He was on the island and he ran around and put out something that way back up. And he then moved to the island and he had chickens and mink.
Oh.
I just left.
Built more into it. That's what I'm doing.
They still came
Every,
in.
oh, I know, I'm just building it up, building it up, building it up.
Yeah.
All right, well, we might as well get rolling here. I'll just kind of explain what's going on. I'll call the meeting to order. Thank you, everybody, for coming in to see this committee of the whole. Sue Ellen is on her way. Allison will not be here. Maureen?
I haven't heard
We're not
from them.
quite
I
sure.
think she might be coming off that boat as well.
Okay, but I think we will get going if you don't mind, David. Sure. And we do have quorum here, so
Yeah.
oh, there's Maureen right there as we speak. Thank you.
Apologies.
No worries. All right, so this is a committee of the whole meeting, and so we'll go for the approval of the agenda. Does anybody have anything they'd like to add to this agenda, or should we just carry on? Thank you. Somebody for the agenda. Thanks, Rob. Second, or Michael. All in favor? Thank you. The agenda is moved. Moving right into new business. Councillor David Hocking, presentation and draft, Bowen 2050 climate change strategy. Thank you, David.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. So with, I did a lot of work on this with a lot of help from the Environment and Climate Action Advisory Committee. Also, I checked with our municipal engineer on some parts of it. Got some help from Metro Vancouver staff and also from the head of the Community Energy Association, ran it by him as well. Got some feedback. So I've had feedback from quite a few folks. What I'm asking is that you then submit it to or send it to the appropriate committees for their comment and feedback. But obviously there's some fairly strong statements in here and there's a very aggressive target, so I thought it would be appropriate to give some context and some background and then answer any questions and comments. I do have slides actually that will cover each of the kind of the 8 clusters of activities or strategies, but I don't think we probably need to go there. We can just, but I do have a bunch of contextual stuff. So first of all, just a picture of the island. Is that what it will look like in 2050? We hope so, but let's see. Let's see if I got it right. Yeah, so part of this is we've had a whole lot of these climate emergency declarations. So, what's that all about? Why has this happened? And, you could expect it perhaps from the City of Vancouver and the Islands Trust, but we've got other folks who you might not expect it from, like such as Edmonton and West Vancouver, Oak Bay. But what's going on here? A lot of it is work that's done by an outfit called the IPCC. So who on earth are these folks, and can we trust what they say? So that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that was created in '88. And back in '88, the issue was starting to become serious. There was a big conference in Toronto at the time, international conference, and And at that time, actually, it was a bipartisan issue. Like the Republicans believed in the science and were concerned about it, and so did Brian Mulroney, the Conservatives, at that time. And but what Reagan wanted was to make sure that the science could be trusted. And so he actually asked for, and what they got was a really an unusual structure for an organization where it has scientists from around the world, but it also has representatives of every government in the world, so it's 195 or whatever the number is. And so the government representatives have to agree with all of the pieces that, the information that the science comes up with. So what it means then is it's very conservative. Some people have criticized the IPCC as being too extreme. Well, actually, it is by nature very conservative because every government has to agree to everything that comes out of it. What it does, it doesn't do science, it assesses the science that's done around the world by universities, by people like the UK Royal Society, the US National Academy of Sciences, and so on. And it looks at the science into three categories. That's like the science itself, okay, what do we predict is going to happen? And they look at complex issues such as cloud formation, like water vapor. In a warmer world, you get more water vapor. Water vapor is itself a greenhouse gas. Oh, but it creates clouds. What do clouds do? Do they make it colder or keep the heat in? And so they look at those complicated science and things such as that. They also look at the impacts on, okay, for having a warmer world, what does that mean for plants and animals and people? And then finally, they also do reports on what can we do about this. As I said, they don't do the science, they work with other people. They've done 5 assessment reports. The new one is coming out in 22. And they do special reports. And it's a special report that came out a year ago that's kind of caused all the latest discussion. But just a little bit about the science, and there's something important here. So this is CO2 levels. Through kind of the recent historical period, it's been about 280 parts per million. It's now at 510. So this graph just goes back 400,000 years. But if you want to find when there was 510 parts per million of CO2, you have to go back somewhere between 3 and 5 million years. The world was about 3 degrees warmer then, and the oceans were 20 to 30 meters higher than they are right now. So the beach is just down here a bit. Temperature, we're now about 1 degree warmer than pre-industrial times, 1.1. And sea level rises just shows in the last 20 years or so, it's about 8 centimeters. It's been about twice that since the beginning of the century. But it's hard to figure out where it'll be at the end of the century, probably about 1 meter, but some people say a lot more, some people say a bit less. So this is a report that's caused all the recent fuss. This came out about a year ago, October, and what happened, you'll remember there was a Paris Agreement that all the countries signed a few years ago to keep temperature below 2 degrees, but they said, or further. And so the IPCC was asked to assess what's the difference between 2 degrees and a little bit less, 1.5 degrees. 1.5, by the way, is where we'll be, it's already kind of baked into the system, where we'll be in about 2035, 2040. And so it's that report that said, actually, yes, it's important that we try to hold to 1.5, but to get there, it's extremely difficult. It means that little stuff I've got bolded there, net zero by 2050 and 45% reduction in CO2 emissions by 10 years from now, which is obviously extremely difficult for the planet to do. I did some work reading this document, and I pulled a few pieces out of it as to why this is important. So they have various summary documents. This is one, you can read what it says. And I ask you all just to read that. Well, maybe I'll read it so people at the back can. Exceeding the 1.5 degree limit, even if only temporarily, will lead us into a highly uncertain world. Such an overshoot will push a number of natural and human systems beyond their limits of adaptation and into possible futures about which we have limited scientific knowledge and no institutional or governance experience. So, best not to go there. I've then pulled a few pieces out. There are a whole bunch of graphs that show the differences, and I've pulled some of them out. And so it's like 2 degrees versus 1.5 degrees. You can read through that. I've been working on this for a long time, probably about 30 years. And it's been framed in my head for a long time as an environmental issue, and that's how the public sort of sees it, but it's not just an environmental issue. It's a human issue, it's an economic issue, it's a social justice issue. you can read the pieces here. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about one of them. The second one, twice as many people suffering water scarcity. So I was in Kyoto 22 years ago, and what it's like at a conference like that is there are all kinds of scientific presentations. And so I was looking at one that was about water and drought and water scarcity. And I looked at the central area of Africa, and I thought, this is just terrible. It was going to be getting drier and drier and drier. And that was 20 years ago, and that's the area that's called the Sahel. So what have you heard about the Sahel lately? The Sahel is where we're breeding Islamic terrorists. That's where they kidnap girls and burn villages down. Why is this happening? Well, there have been reports about why it's happening. It's because it's been getting drier and drier. The economy has gone, the food is gone, and so young guys have nothing to do. What do young guys do when they have nothing to do? They join gangs. And they, burn down villages and kidnap schoolgirls. And, that's terrible, obviously, for the people of the Sahel area of Africa, but it's also a terrible thing for the world, because when you're trying to deal with things like terrorism like that, this is climate change, and droughts are breeders of terrorists. So it's also an environmental issue, and you can see some of these, like the third one, coral reefs. I love snorkeling, and so coral reefs are lovely things to see. But of course, it's absolutely not just about what we see. It's about they're the places where fish grow up. So they're like, like seagrass kind of thing in tropical. So that's where that's a nursery for tropical fish. So for fishing for people who need fish around the world, this is a disaster. And to get to 2 degrees versus 1.5, it's not like we do a heck of a lot, but it's 90% versus virtually all gone. That AB plus BC, that's the permafrost. That's 2 million square kilometers. That's Alberta plus BC. That's the size of that. That's what those words are about. So about a year ago, I was working, before I became a councillor, so I was working with Metro Vancouver on this document here, this Climate 2050 Strategic Framework. I did the engagement with First Nations for that. And so about a year ago came out with this document right around the time I became a councillor. Then I got on the Climate Action Committee. We asked the board for staff at Metro Vancouver to assess, well, they've done this, but what about the document that just came out right at the same time that this was published, the 1.5 degrees? So they reassessed it, and this has now been revised in September of 2018 to meet the 1.5 degree target. And they're developing the strategies to get there right now, but that's obviously a challenging thing to do indeed. This next slide shows you the graph of what there's 3 things I think to look at in terms of this graph I'd like to point to. One is obviously this is extremely challenging to be able to get down like this by 2050. 2, you can see that there's those green bars down at the bottom. Those are negative emissions. In other words, by planting trees and by watching soils, by allowing soils to absorb carbon, you can absorb some of the carbon from the atmosphere. And there's also this technical approach, which is a lot of people would question, but there are companies like carbon engineering in Squamish who can take the carbon out of the air and turn it into liquid fuel. So there are some technical solutions. That's why we need a carbon tax to allow things like that to grow. The other thing you should look at is all of these things, none of them go down to 0 except for one. And which one is that? Transportation, cars and trucks. Why is that? Because the capital turnover for cars and trucks is 10, 15, 20 years when people get new trucks, new cars, and buses. For buildings, they don't get new buildings in 10, 20 years. It's hard to fix up old buildings and industry and so on. So it's the good news about cars and trucks being able to get to 0 is most of our emissions are from transportation. So that provides us some opportunity here on Bowen. So that's sort of the background. So now a Bowen Climate 2050 strategy. So their strategy is in the document here to reduce emissions, to the increased resilience. That means adapt to what's going to happen anyway, and to engage the public, because we can't do it without our citizens on site. And it's organized into 3 sort of chunks, kind of quick wins, things we could do in a year or maybe in this term, longer term ones, and then other ones where we're not in control, but we need to support things and advocate for other folks to do stuff. But those words at the bottom are really important. Metro Vancouver is going to come up with new strategies, other people are going to come up with new strategies, we're going to find out new information, new technologies, so it's not like this is a strategy that is sort of carved in stone. This is something that's some ideas that we can work towards, but other things are going to come along. We need to be able to adapt and move as they happen. So this is an old, well, I made the graph, but it's old data. This is the data that the Penman Institute did about 15 years ago about our emissions. There are newer data than that, but it doesn't include the ferry. So I'm just sort of looking at this. Obviously, the numbers are going to be a bit wrong, but the size of the chunks tell us what we need to do. So number 1 is off-island transportation, number 2 is the ferry, number 3 is on-island transportation, and then after that it's homes. I think the slug, that the other piece of the pie that we'll need will be deforestation. And like, because the issue is deforestation. To the extent that we, like a lot of us heat our homes with wood. When you're heating homes with wood, it's 0 CO2 if you're returning to the atmosphere the same amount of CO2 that's being absorbed by the trees. If you're burning more and you're cutting down more trees, then actually you are contributing. So deforestation is an issue that we have to look at. And if we're getting our firewood from off-island, which many people do, okay, what's happening there? We don't really know where that came from, whether there's deforestation involved. So that's, so nevertheless, we need to focus on transportation, but also home heating. It's really important. And the home heating you see here, that'll be from oil and propane. And so obviously we need to do something about that if we can. Transportation, so transportation is a big one. There's only 4 ways you can cut transportation emissions. The first one is better fuel. The federal government's doing that. That's above, that's something that we can get a ride with, but that's nothing that we can do. The other 3 we can. The mode shift, that means getting people out of single occupancy cars and into buses, bikes, whatever, walking, all the other alternatives to that, shared vehicles of some sort. Zero carbon, and there's things that we can do in the plan that would help us do that mode shift, although obviously it requires help from TransLink as well. Zero carbon vehicles, it's not up to us to buy all the vehicles, but there's something that we can do to help people, and we're already doing that by putting in a charging station, and there are other things we can do around that are in this strategy. The last one is interesting, reduce the need for transportation. It sounds weird, but this is actually, in terms of what municipalities can do across Canada, this is probably the biggest thing, and it's about zoning changes. So instead of having people work over here and live way over here, and then go to the community center way over there, trying to bring the things together so that people don't have to move around as much. For us on Bowen, it's a bit different, but there are things we can obviously do, such as having a compost system on the island instead of shipping it all off, such as having a health center on the island so that people don't have to be going into the city in order to do routine health type things. So those are some of the things we could do. There's the idea of a shared office space here. Helping so that local-based industries can stay here, can develop here rather than us relying on people off-island all the time for appropriate time industry. So those are the transportation things we can do. Energy use in building, obviously the SEP code is a huge thing, but that is really important for us, but that's for new buildings, so we need to have a program to help people fix up their existing homes and reduce the energy consumption, particularly if they're relying on oil or propane. Okay, one more piece here, and this is, we have to adapt to the changes that are coming. So this document right here, you can get it if you want from Metro Vancouver, and it's really interesting. It's folks up there. Climate projections for our region, and you can read those words. I don't need to tell you about those, but I'll show you some of the details. So this is, the colors are a bit different, but the past means up to now, roughly up to early this century. Summer daytime high, average hottest day 31 degrees. 2050, quite a bit hotter, warmer than San Diego today, average hottest day 35 degrees. This is an important one. Summer, instead of days over 25 degrees, instead of 22, 55. Sounds great. Who wouldn't want twice as long as summer? Except for this. Summer precipitation down about 20%. So that's, when we look at our forests that are struggling now, and the water issues we've had already, we know that we're going to have a whole lot more, and so we need to deal with that. This, I made this graph from Metro Vancouver scientists produce intensity, duration, IDF curves, intensity, duration, frequency, and it's for extreme events. And the extreme, I've got that 740K, That's what, $750,000 damage to culverts and our dock last year from extreme events. So this is the average rainfall increase from each of these extreme events is sort of what you can expect. Now, I'm not an expert at this, and the data was really complicated, but our staff will need to look at these IDF curves. It's all there at Metro Vancouver, and they can sort of figure out so that when we're doing our analysis of our asset management, we can apply these curves to it and understand what we need to do. So this penultimate slide, I think it is about adaptation, increased resilience adaptation. So we need to protect our built infrastructure, and so that means when we do our asset management plan, this is roads, culverts, buildings, we should look at okay, what are the risks, and then develop a plan to handle that risk and cost it out. Increased protection from droughts and wildfire. One of the suggestions we have is that we store water, that we look at the opportunity to have rainfall collection for all new homes, or to encourage it in some way. And that's because the water, our biggest water use is people watering their gardens. And if you're storing rainwater and watering your garden from stored rainwater, you're doing several things. First of all, you're putting less stress on our engineered system, but also that means less stress on the groundwater that's supplying our engineered system. So you're leaving some water for trees and other species. The other thing is by storing water in the winter, you're slowing water down going across and into the ocean, and then you're putting it into your garden, which is replenishing the water table to some degree. So it's a good thing to try to store more water. And then finally, protecting natural systems. There's things in there such as the conservation development policy and preventing logging to obviously protect the stress systems that come from that changed climate. I think that might be it. Yeah, engage Bowen residents. So in order to do this, obviously we have to have our residents involved, and I was chatting with Maureen about this and saying, how are we going to do that? What would that be like? And she said, don't worry, the residents are already engaged. And she was right. Maureen and Swellen and I were right in the middle of that crowd. And, we got 100,000 people, and we're bumping into Bowen Island people as we were there. We had, Peter's bus took a bunch of students and parents. And so there was lots of concern, lots of fabulous Bowen signs that I saw. So that's sort of an introduction. But my last slide is this one here. So Paul Polman, I know of Paul Polman. He retired in December a year ago as the CEO of one of the world's biggest companies, Unilever. They do a lot of consumer brand stuff. And so the biggest intergenerational crime, and this to me is the essence of what's going on when I look at my grandkids. I just think, what on earth are we going to do? And so that's what I'd like to leave you with. And please, any questions, comments about the plan itself?
Well, thank you, David. That's extraordinarily thorough and shocking, of course, but I don't think there's anybody in this room that is a climate change denier. There's no question about that. We know it's changing. We just look at last year. Look at those ferry cancellations and stuff like that, which we haven't had in 50 years. And the atmosphere is changing. It's so much more robust than it used to be. The storms are worse, the rainfall's worse, everything's worse. So there's absolutely no question that we've got to move on this, and the faster we move on it, the better off everybody's going to be. I like some of the short-term stuff. I like the one about the bikes, and there are certain departments in the municipality that could, like bylaws or something like that, would be great on electric bikes.
That came from the Community Energy Association. It was his idea. I
thought that was awesome.
Yeah.
There's a lot of it that doesn't work, but that would certainly be a great improvement. But it's an education piece to all the rest of it. And I thank you for bringing it forward. Any other comments?
Yeah,
Rob?
I'll make about thanks, David, for that. That was good. And I think, how do we take this information and from a council public policy perspective, how do we start implementing it and moving in that direction? And one of the things, and I've seen this over the last year, and I think we need to, as a council, put more focus on this, is looking at projects moving forward and seeing, are we building towards a success? And so for instance, when we're building a new fire hall, are we building fewer parking spots if we want fewer cars, or are we quadrupling the parking? And this goes to every single one of the projects that we need to be looking at, is how are we making sure that when we're building new buildings, it's gonna represent 2050 where we want to be at. And I think that's going to be a challenge. And to me, like I was at that climate march. I find it a bit tough to march and things because I did it 25 years ago, and you know, we haven't gone in a great direction. And I'm a bit of a talks cheap person, but I hope that we as a council can, you know, really take this kind of information, and every single time we make a decision, we start questioning, why are we doing this when really we're trying to get to there? And I think that'll be the challenge, where we start implementing the stuff instead of just big level conversations and little statutes we put on our desk because we met some report that we did. And so I think that'll be the challenge.
I could just add a little bit. I mean, there's no question it'll be a difficult challenge. For example, look at our community center. We're already worried about how much it's going to cost, but we're building something that'll last more than 30 years. And in 30 years, it's supposed to be zero emissions. And I hate to say this, because I don't want to throw a spanner in the works in terms of the community center stuff. It's already been hard enough. But, you know, these are the tough decisions that are before us.
Michael?
Listen, Bowen, thank you very much. On number 6, longer term,
Yes.
at the bottom there, it said set regulations permitted under the Buildings Act to require fire-resistant roofing, siding, decks and other elements of all new building. Has it contemplated any form of incentives for existing buildings?
Great idea.
I mean, I just ask because there's so much, we have so many more existing buildings in comparison to new ones for the foreseeable period of time. And it's going to be a long time before the new buildings catch up on all the old ones. We haven't mentioned incentives for anything that improves the situation. Just
Just a
a
good
question.
point, Michael. I mean, we've got the fire smart recommendations about what to do with decks, so that you know, cinders don't get underneath and all that kind of stuff. I mean, that we should actually slap that in here. It'd be dead simple to put it in.
There's also discussion in the current federal election of subsidies for energy certificates
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
forth. And I think that when it comes to cash subsidies or cash incentives, it's more likely that they would be viable at different levels of government than the local level.
Yeah. Sorry, Michael, you had more? Yeah.
Well, yes, just one. On 3, again, looking there at the longer term, and when it says when considering new residential developments, give priority to those located in or near snow. I think everyone sees why that is, right? That doesn't need an explanation.
Yeah.
But we are going to maybe get some pocket developments. We may get some small home communities.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that we don't write that with a big stamp and just maintain a sense of balance there, because otherwise what we're going to have is like a sort of wall around Snow Cove, and everything either fits inside or it doesn't. And there's only so much space available over the longer term.
Yeah, I agree.
So,
I'm just wanted to say thank you for all this work. I'm excited to see it, and I'm pleased to see it, because there's been a few times when I've asked questions about facilities and, for example, our new water treatment plant, but we didn't have any policy to draw on except for GHG emissions in our RCP and general kinds of guidelines, but nothing that I could really specifically act or vote on, or that we could provide as guidance. So I'm excited to see this. I think the idea of that Rob says about making sure that anything we do from, I'm glad to see the wording about emergency in here, because it implies that any project, any work we do from here on has to be directionally correct, right? It's not enough to sort of have say, well, we're so far down the road with this, I think we need to look at things as we go, because it's an emergency. And I just wanted to reinforce what Maureen said, is that grant funding is coming. I don't think, by doing this, I don't read anything in here that we, the municipality, and Bowen taxpayers are going to pay other Bowen taxpayers to make their houses better or anything. I think there's funding that we can apply for, and a lot of the groundwork that we've done through advocating with other levels of government and opening revenue streams that other grants that we've been applying for and that we're now eligible for may help with that. Anyway, I'm in support.
Allison, go ahead.
Sorry, I missed the beginning. Learning all about wildfire management plans this afternoon from this morning. Looking at, picking up on Michael's comment, I think there was wording in the OCP about located in or near Snug Cove and other already developing areas like the density transfer. So I think Seymour Bay area was recognized as another area which could accept more. But the other was, Jen and I were talking, and can 6 be split into 2? One dealing with drugs and one dealing with wildfire? Because I think there's, some of the strategies are different. You don't relate one to the other, and we could, there's a bunch more strategies for, you know, pervious surfaces, for example, instead of paved driveways and things like that for the rainwater catchment, purple pipes and all that kind of stuff that, you know, people with wells having storage tanks, not just, you know, talking around. And, yeah, so those are just a few sort of quick comments.
Yeah, I think the, obviously the concept, and there's some low-hanging fruit here, you know, real simple stuff. Like, and we'd have to look into it, but just having mandatory cisterns. You know, you can buy a cistern for, you know, especially when you're building a house and you're spending a lot of money, put $1,000 cistern in there, it's gonna take 3,000 gallons of water for your garden or whatever you're gonna do. It's a huge step forward, because our water resources are very, very fragile and very, very precious to us. The other thing, conservation development, I think that should be an absolute no-brainer, and it just, we have to look at that. And as far as saving all our green space too, we've got to have that green cent over there.
But that's coming to the Advisory Planning Commission. Unfortunately, on the 21st, which is election night, so.
Yeah.
Not the greatest night.
You don't get excited.
It's hard to choose. I think we should be, and my personal opinion is we should be, and that's a council decision whether we declare, you know, obviously a climate emergency, and I think that's an absolute no-brainer. The more that we are enthusiastic about doing something about climate change, the more enthusiastic the public's going to be, and they'll see the process. And yeah, there's a lot of other things we can do that aren't really costly. A lot of costly things too that we're going to have to take a long-range approach at. Rob first, and then.
Yeah, Gary, I'll just dovetail on the cost thing, because I think that's one of the mistakes that's been made in the environmental community, but also that we hear within governments as well, is, oh, this is gonna cost us a fortune, and, you know, like that Squamish, let's pull carbon out of the air is a good example of that. But a lot of this is actually, it's a hell of a lot cheaper to do it this way than the way we've been doing it. It's a lot cheaper to move people in public transit than to build big bridges and highways. Conservation development's another good one. You know, we can build roads all through our forests that we gotta maintain and pay for and pave, or we can put them in one area and have a little road going in, and that's gonna save us a hell of a lot of money. So, you know, looking for grants and all that, I think a lot of this is completely doable. It's just a policy change in direction we need to make. And I honestly think it'll be a hell of a lot cheaper doing it this way than the old way we've been doing it. So I think that's sort of one of the positives, and I don't want people to think, oh, how are you ever gonna afford this? Because I think it's, how are we gonna afford to keep doing what we've been doing right now? I think that's the unaffordable part of it. So.
Don't have much of a choice.
And we don't have much.
Maureen?
Yes, thank you, David. And I'd just like to acknowledge that we went through a pretty rigorous process to come to this point with multiple meetings and arguments and so forth. So it's a committee product driven by David, and I'm very happy with it. Just a couple of comments in passing. The whole garden issue and the water and making sure that our gardens thrive and so forth. Some groups in the community have been talking about maybe we need to do our gardens differently. Maybe we need to be growing things differently. And I think that that's important to keep in mind because it does have a relationship to how much water is actually required. A couple of years ago when Bonnie and Sue Ellen and I were working with the Community Energy Association, we had a workshop. Allison attended that as well. One of the points that stuck with me was how much of the housing stock on Bowen Island was due for a refresh. It was something like 50 or 60%, just given the age of the housing stock. So the potential building code requirements related to existing housing stock, I'm looking forward to seeing what those actually might be and what kind of support would be available for people who do want to make changes to their homes, to retrofit their homes. And then the third and the final point that I wanted to make is that this was sparked by a whole bunch of things, but one of the things that sparked it was a whole lot of kids coming to Municipal Hall in March and talking to the mayor and asking the mayor to declare a climate emergency. So the kids of Bowen Island are very much contributors to this document.
Thanks,
But in your presentation, you talked about something, forgive me, you're going to have to take me out about change. Do you remember you said you were open to change or somewhere at the very beginning? You
Flexible
talked,
and adaptable?
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, I'm so glad, and I hope that gets really built into this, and I'll tell you
Yeah.
why, because just as we maybe be able to snatch carbon out through NIPS and development, one has to believe that this has become an industry. It's had an unprecedented amount of publicity worldwide.
Yeah.
What a start. I mean, every investment guru will tell you, hey, if you want to look at up and coming new stuff, new ventures, new companies. So I hope that gets built into this, because what is available to us as we have this meeting here in October 2019, do you have sort of like an update program for this, where you just to build in all these changes that we're bombarded with? Because this is great, and this has got today's date on it.
Yeah.
How do you see it just going through a sensible filter? Is it annually, or every 3 years or 4 years? Say, hey, wait a second, some new stuff has happened since then, and as a result, we need to do an update. Have you thought about just a sort of healthy refreshment program where you take the document and say, hey, there's our document. Wow, we just need to read through this again, because some of it now looks October 2019.
Well, in the terms of reference of the Environment and Climate Action Advisory Committee, that's one of the things that's asked. It's being asked to do. So that could be an annual review by that group to say, what are the latest trends, new things happen? Because as Maureen was saying, there are going to be new policies. Both the federal government is saying, they've actually, the Liberal, so they're not the government right now, but what the Liberal Party platform has that same target of the zero emissions by 2050. So they've said that they would need new actions to get there because they don't have them right now. The province is looking to strengthen its actions as well. So there's all kinds of stuff that's going to happen, and we don't know what it is now. I sort of, when you think, okay, that we're saying 30 years from now, zero carbon, and so if you cast back 30 years, so that was 1988, 1989, and at that time, life was kind of similar to this in lots of ways, except for we didn't have any of this stuff. And we had no idea, no way of even imagining it. That there's, something like this you could carry around that's the size of a pack of cards, and it's a better camera than any you've ever had before, and it's also a telephone, and it's also a computer. It also can connect to anyone else in the world. I mean,
It can tell you when the bus is coming.
yeah. So we couldn't imagine something like that. So, things are going to happen, and we need to be ready to, jump.
Embrace it.
Yeah.
Any further discussion? David, do you want to read the recommendation? And you don't have to do the whereases unless you really want to.
No, I won't do the rest.
Therefore, the result.
that council recognize that climate change represents an emergency for Bowen Island and commits to developing a strategy to reduce emissions in alignment with the targets to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and to refer for comment the draft Bowen Island 2050 climate change strategy to the municipality's Transportation Advisory Committee, Community Economic Development Committee, Advisory Planning Commission, Finance Advisory Commission, and the Parks, Trails, and Greenways Advisory Committee.
Yeah, and just the beginning of that, therefore be resolved that the committee of the whole recommended council. So,
Right,
yes,
sorry.
thank you.
Yeah.
Second.
Okay, further discussion, all in favor? Pass unanimously. Thank you very much, that's great. Thanks, David, I really appreciate you bringing that forward. And on that note, I will call for adjournment.
Yes,
Thank you, Michael. It is adjourned. All right, dinner time.
Okay.